When the tension in the hearing room started to rise, many assumed Jasmine Crockett would meet Linda McMahon's tone with the same kind of energy, sharp, defensive, maybe even fiery. After all, it wouldn't have been surprising, but what came next was something entirely different, something that made the entire room take notice. When Linda tossed her jab, "Maybe if you spent less time on theatrics and more on facts, we could get somewhere," the insult was meant to rattle her. It was a calculated dig, designed to throw her off balance in front of cameras and colleagues. Yet Crockett's response was the opposite of what anyone expected. Instead of a flash of irritation, there was only silence. She took a slow breath, flipped through her notes, and looked up at Linda with a calm, almost measured expression. That moment of quiet was her power. It wasn't weakness, it was control. People often underestimate what composure can do in a heated setting. The stillness Jasmine held wasn't just silence. It was strategy. She let Linda's words hang in the air long enough for everyone in that room to recognize their pettiness. It was the kind of moment that shifts perspective before a single rebuttal is even made. Crockett knew that reacting emotionally would give Linda exactly what she wanted, a distraction. So instead, she took that energy and turned it into focus. "Ms. McMahon," she began softly, her tone measured, almost conversational. "Facts are my specialty. Let's start with yours." Those few words, delivered without a hint of aggression, had more impact than any raised voice could have achieved. The hearing transformed from a confrontation into a masterclass in restraint. Crockett's.com presence made Linda's earlier jab seem unnecessary, even childish. It wasn't just about the insult anymore. It was about how the two women handled pressure. One relied on provocation, the other on patience. As the exchange continued, Linda's body language began to shift. First defensive, then uneasy. She realized too late that the calm she mistook for passivity was actually discipline. Jasmine didn't need to interrupt or overtalk. She simply guided the conversation back toward accountability. Every time Linda tried to redirect or Crockett's responses were clear, grounded, and delivered with the kind of precision that only comes when emotion doesn't cloud judgment. Even the committee members noticed the change in rhythm. The once lively back and forth had quieted into something more deliberate. Reporters in the back began to scribble faster, sensing the subtle shift of control. Linda, who had entered the room confident and in command, was now visibly recalibrating her tone. Jasmine, on the other hand, seemed untouched, her focus unbroken, her confidence unshaken. She wasn't performing for the cameras. She wasn't playing to the crowd. She was doing what she came to do: question, clarify, and correct. That's what made her composure so effective. It was authentic. It came from a place of knowing exactly who she was and why she was there. For Jasmine. Calculated composure wasn't about suppressing her feelings. It was about channeling them. She understood that leadership, especially in public scrutiny, isn't defined by how loudly one speaks, but by how one holds ground when challenged. Linda's comment may have been personal, but Jasmine refused to make the hearing about ego. Instead, she transformed it into a demonstration of discipline. Each word she chose after that insult was deliberate. Each pause carried intention. It was as if she had taken control of the tempo, forcing everyone else, including Linda, to follow her pace. Behind her calm demeanor was preparation. She had done her research, reviewed her data, and understood the context of every topic being discussed. That preparation gave her the quiet confidence that kept her grounded even in provocation. Linda might have had the microphone, but Jasmine had the facts. And more importantly, she had patience. That patience was her armor, a shield against the kind of baiting that derails many hearings. The cameras captured everything: the way she leaned slightly forward when listening, the steady tone of her voice, the confidence in her phrasing. It wasn't flashy, but it was powerful in its simplicity. The calmness also exposed something bigger about leadership, that sometimes the strongest rebuttal isn't a counterattack, but composure itself. Linda's attempt to provoke her ended up making Jasmine look even more in control. Every person watching, both in the room and later through clips online, could sense that balance. The moment Linda's frustration became visible, Jasmine's confidence became undeniable. That's what made it calculated composure, not just emotional restraint, but strategic silence, measured timing, and awareness of impact. When the session moved forward, it was clear who commanded the room. The more Linda spoke, the less commanding her words felt. The more Jasmine responded calmly, the more her authority grew. By the end, what people remembered wasn't the insult, it was the unshakable way Jasmine Crockett handled it. In a world where heated exchanges often defined politics, her stillness became the loudest thing in the room. The shift in the room began quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it was there. After Linda McMahon's attempt to undermine Jasmine Crockett with that pointed insult, something changed in the atmosphere. Where others might have responded, emotionally or defensively, Crockett leaned on something far more powerful: the truth. She didn't have to shout or prove her worth. She simply had to remind everyone in that room what she already knew: the facts. It was in that moment that she began to reverse the entire direction of the hearing, and she did it using Linda's own record as the foundation. As the hearing resumed, Crockett's tone remained calm, deliberate, and centered. She started by acknowledging the topic they were supposed to be discussing, the oversight of government contracts and accountability in federal programs. Since we're speaking of focus, Ms. McMahon, she began, let's focus on the record. Her words were pointed but professional. She didn't accuse, she revealed. Line by line, she started referencing data and prior statements Linda herself had made. Every number, every quote, every document was pulled from the official record, and the way she laid it out wasn't confrontational, it was clinical. Each piece of evidence connected seamlessly to the next, creating a chain that was impossible to ignore. Linda tried to maintain her confident demeanor. But with each citation, that confidence began to falter. Crockett reminded her of discrepancies between her past remarks about small business equity and the funding allocations under her leadership. Then she highlighted a report that contradicted Linda's testimony from a previous session. The precision in Jasmine's questioning was undeniable. It wasn't random or emotional, it was meticulous. Every fact she presented had purpose, and every question was phrased in a way that left no easy exit. I'm sure you recall saying this before this committee, Crockett said at one point, reading from the transcript. Linda nodded stiffly. Then could you explain why the numbers from your department tell a different story? The pause that followed said everything. The hearing room grew quiet again. Not from tension this time, but from realization. The audience began to understand what was happening. Jasmine wasn't just defending herself from an insult, she was methodically turning the tables. Linda had tried to label her as emotional and unfocused, but now Crockett was proving she was the only one in control of the facts. The insult that was meant to diminish her had become the very reason her brilliance stood out. This was her form of reversal, not through outrage, but through evidence. Reporters scribbled faster, aware they were witnessing something rare, a congressional exchange where intellect outshined aggression. Jasmine's composure, paired with her sharp grasp of the record, made it impossible to dismiss her as theatrical or unprepared. Each time Linda tried to pivot the conversation away from the uncomfortable points, Crockett redirected it back, using documentation, oversight reports, and prior votes as anchors. We can keep this on paper if you prefer, she said at one point, her tone neutral, because facts tend not to change. It wasn't just a clever remark, it was a reminder that the truth doesn't bend to ego. For every moment Linda had earlier appeared dominant, Crockett now appeared steady and unshakable. The shift wasn't loud or abrupt, it was gradual, like a tide rolling in. One question at a time, she dismantled Linda's arguments and replaced them with reality. It was the kind of intellectual pressure that couldn't be countered with charisma or status. It required knowledge, and Crockett had come prepared. Linda began referencing her notes more frequently, stumbling slightly on a few figures. Camera zoomed in as the discomfort became more visible. Jasmine didn't gloat, didn't smirk, she stayed professional, even empathetic in tone. Her goal wasn't humiliation, it was correction, and that made her reversal all the more powerful. What stood out most was how she used Linda's own words as her strongest evidence. It wasn't an attack, it was a reflection. Everything Linda had once said, Crockett mirrored back to her, framed in contrast with the real outcomes. The audience didn't need persuasion. The truth spoke for itself. Linda's earlier attempt to establish dominance now felt hollow against Crockett's quiet precision. The dynamic had completely flipped. The person who had tried to discredit her was now the one under scrutiny, and the shift happened so smoothly that it felt almost inevitable. As the questioning went on, even those who weren't originally aligned with Crockett began to nod along. Her arguments were grounded, factual, and impossible to dismiss as emotional or partisan. She had built her defense not by attacking, but by exposing inconsistencies. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about restoring balance, showing that truth could stand on its own, even in the face of disrespect. By the time the hearing reached its midpoint, the conversation had been completely Linda's initial comment, intended to make Jasmine look unprepared, now seemed absurd in hindsight. Every person watching knew who had command of the facts. Jasmine Crockett didn't just reverse the insult, she reversed the narrative. Her quiet confidence turned scrutiny into respect. Through steady logic and relentless accuracy, she reminded everyone in that room, including Linda McMahon, that when truth walks into the conversation, arrogance has no place to stand. The way Jasmine Crockett held the room that day wasn't through volume or outrage, it was through presence. Controlled, grounded, and perfectly measured. Her demeanor spoke louder than any verbal sparring could. When Linda McMahon tried to unsettle her earlier, Crockett didn't just stay calm. She took command of the atmosphere itself. The longer the hearing went on, the clearer it became that control wasn't about dominance, it was about discipline. She knew when to pause, when to speak, and when silence could do the work for her. It was this quiet command that made even her critics stop and listen. As Linda continued to speak, trying to regain her footing after Crockett's factual reversals, Jasmine never broke her rhythm. She sat with an ease that conveyed both authority and patience. When she leaned forward to speak, it wasn't aggressive, it was deliberate. Her posture, her timing, even the way she turned pages from her notes, all of it reflected someone who understood the psychology of power. Control wasn't in her words alone. It was in the way she carried herself. There was no trace of fluster, no sign of irritation, and that composure began to unsettle Linda in ways that were subtle but visible. Asterisk at one point. Linda tried to redirect the conversation, suggesting that Jasmine was focusing too narrowly on technicalities. It was a familiar tactic, a way of downplaying valid criticism, but Jasmine's response was calm and piercing. Technicalities, she said, are often what separate good governance from bad decisions. She didn't raise her tone, she didn't rush her words, yet the statement landed with weight. The room went silent again, not because she demanded it, but because her control demanded respect. Even the chairman gave a small nod, signaling that the conversation had found its balance again. Asterisk. Crockett's ability to maintain controlled presence came from something deeper than political training. It came from understanding that authority doesn't need to be performed, it needs to be felt. The people in that hearing room could feel it. Her voice was steady, her pacing unhurried, and her focus unwavering. When she looked at Linda, it wasn't with hostility, it was with intent. It was as if she was saying, "You can challenge me, but you can't shake me." That subtle difference changed the entire tone of the exchange. Asterisk, there's a kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. And Jasmine embodied that perfectly. Each time Linda tried to inject sarcasm or a dismissive comment, it only made Crockett's calmness more striking. The cameras caught every moment, the contrast between agitation and self-possession, and the more composed Jasmine remained, the more respect she quietly earned from those watching. What might have begun as a clash slowly turned into a demonstration of steadiness under pressure. Asterisk, her control also extended to the structure of her questioning. She paced her dialogue with precision. No wasted words, no unnecessary diversions. When Linda hesitated or deflected, Jasmine would simply wait, maintaining eye contact, giving her space to answer. That patience wasn't passive, it was tactical. It placed pressure on Linda without confrontation. People underestimate how silence can corner someone, how restraint can communicate authority better than any raised voice. Jasmine understood that perfectly. Asterisk in the back of the room. Some aides began exchanging looks. They knew the momentum had shifted. Even when Linda tried to bring the discussion back to broader themes or past achievements, it didn't land the same way. Crockett's control had reframed the energy. Her steadiness made every attempt at deflection more obvious. She didn't interrupt or over-explain. She simply guided the hearing back to focus. It was professionalism at its purest form, the kind that doesn't need to be announced because it's self-evident. Asterisk, what also stood out was how she handled the moments between exchanges. She would take notes, listen attentively, and occasionally nod to acknowledge a point, even one she disagreed with. That display of respect wasn't weakness, it was strategy. It reinforced the perception that she was grounded in reason, not ego. Linda's irritation, meanwhile, began to look more like defensiveness. The emotional contrast between the two women was becoming impossible to ignore. Asterisk. The committee members seemed to pick up on it too. A few of them who had earlier leaned toward Linda's arguments now started echoing Jasmine's phrasing in their follow-up questions. That subtle alignment was a reflection of her influence in real time. She had taken control of the pace, tone, and direction of the hearing not through power plays, but through restraint. Linda, who had entered with seniority and confidence, now found herself following Jasmine's rhythm. Asterisk, in a political space where loudness often wins attention, Jasmine Crockett's control reminded everyone that power doesn't always come with noise. Her presence was quiet but commanding, her focus absolute. Even as Linda tried to reassert herself, she was already reacting to Jasmine's lead. It was no longer a contest between two figures, it was a clear example of what true composure looks like when tested in public. Each measured word from Crockett carried more influence than any exaggerated statement could. She didn't just control the conversation, she controlled. By the time the hearing reached its final stretch, it was clear that something remarkable had happened. The entire narrative had shifted. What began as a small, cutting insult from Linda McMahon toward Jasmine Crockett had turned into a moment of quiet transformation. The early focus, Linda's attempt to belittle Jasmine, had evaporated, replaced by a collective recognition of how completely Crockett had taken control. Even those who hadn't been paying much attention at first, now watched intently, sensing that the balance of respect in the room had changed. Through calm logic and firm precision, Jasmine had not only defended herself but reversed the public perception entirely. Asterisk. When the clip of the exchange later spread online, it wasn't Linda's words that people were talking about. It was Jasmine's reaction. The still image that circulated most widely showed her in mid-sentence, composed, focused, and utterly unshaken. Commentators noted how her confidence never faltered, even when provoked. It wasn't an emotional moment. It was a demonstration of professional control. In a space where confrontation usually steals the spotlight, Jasmine managed to make self-restraint the story. Her ability to turn a personal attack into a professional victory became the real takeaway of that day. Asterisk inside the hearing. The contrast had been impossible to ignore. Linda, once commanding in tone, had softened her approach. now answering more carefully and less dismissively. She seemed to realize that the tone she set early on had backfired. Jasmine, meanwhile, didn't have to announce her victory. The room reflected it for her. Her colleagues began treating her remarks with new weight. The subtle nods, the shift in attention, the quiet respect, all spoke volumes. The same words that were meant to discredit her had instead elevated her stature. Asterisk, that reversal wasn't accidental. It was a result of discipline and consistency. Jasmine Crockett understood that perception in politics isn't just built by what you say, but by how you carry yourself under scrutiny. When Linda insulted her professionalism, Jasmine didn't respond by defending her worth. She simply demonstrated it. That difference became the hinge of the entire encounter. Her approach showed that credibility isn't claimed through argument. It's earned through behavior. Even those who had walked into the hearing skeptical of her found themselves reassessing their impressions. Asterisk. The power of that moment extended beyond the committee room. For people watching from outside, especially women and young professionals, Jasmine's handling of the situation carried a kind of lesson that integrity and confidence can coexist without aggression. The headlines that followed were telling. Crockett turns insult into lesson in composure, and Mcmahon's comment backfires as Crockett commands hearing. The public narrative no longer centered on the insult itself. It centered on how she responded. And in the world of politics, where perception often shapes influence, that shift mattered deeply. Asterisk, even Linda's own allies were quiet afterward. No one wanted to amplify the clip that showcased their side as dismissive or patronizing. Instead, it became a viral example of how power can be redefined in real time. Crockett didn't just survive the hearing, she transformed it into a showcase of credibility. Her every word afterward seemed to carry new weight. The respect she earned wasn't just for her arguments, but for her restraint. People began quoting her line, "When you question my focus, I'll respond with receipts," as if it were a mantra for professionalism under fire. Asterisk, that single sentence, spoken calmly, embodied her entire strategy. Don't fight noise with noise. Fight it with truth. It summed up the reversal perfectly. Linda had tried to frame Jasmine as unprepared, unfocused, even theatrical. But through her measured responses, Crockett made it impossible to maintain that image. By staying grounded, she exposed Linda's provocation for what it was, an emotional overreach. And when that became clear, the crowd's perception flipped completely. What had started as an attempt to question her capability turned into validation of it. Asterisk, by the end. When the chair officially closed the session, there was no applause. No grand moment, but there didn't need to be. The silence carried its own meaning. Everyone knew who had owned the day. Linda gathered her papers quickly, her earlier assertiveness replaced by visible discomfort. Jasmine, meanwhile, took her time, reviewing her notes, speaking briefly to staffers, maintaining that same calm energy she had carried throughout. She didn't look triumphant, she looked steady. That, in itself, made her presence even more commanding. Asterisk outside. As reporters swarmed for comments, the difference in body language told the whole story. Linda was brisk, offering short, careful responses. Jasmine was poised, speaking clearly and with a steady rhythm, addressing the issues without rehashing the personal moment. She didn't gloat, didn't comment on the insult, and didn't frame herself as the victim. She didn't need to. Everyone else had already seen how the scene unfolded. Her professionalism had spoken for itself. Asterisk, the viral moment that emerged afterward didn't make Jasmine look dramatic or defensive. It made her look strong. People replayed the clip not to see conflict, but to see how she managed it. That's what made the reversal so complete. The fact that she didn't force it. Through her composure, logic, and presence, she had quietly rewritten the story. What began as a jab meant to minimize her ended up amplifying her authority. And from that day forward, Linda McMahon's comment wasn't remembered as an insult. It was remembered as the spark that showed just how powerful Jasmine Crockett could be when challenged. When the hearing finally concluded, and the last exchange faded into silence, the story had already written itself. There was no dramatic exit, no raised voices, no need for a declaration of victory. The entire room understood what had just taken place. Linda McMahon, who entered the hearing confident and ready to assert control, had left with her composure tested and her remarks turned against her. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, had done something far more impressive than winning an argument. She had redefined it. Her calm, focused, and steady performance wasn't about proving superiority. It was about reminding everyone what true professionalism looks like under pressure. Asterisk in politics. Perception is often shaped by the loudest moment in the room, but Jasmine's quiet steadiness created a different kind of noise, one that lingered long after the camera stopped rolling. People didn't talk about confrontation. They talked about composure. They didn't quote insults. They quoted her restraint. The shift in narrative was subtle but powerful. She had changed the meaning of the entire hearing through self-control and intellect. By refusing to react impulsively, she allowed the truth to become her defense and her demeanor to become her message. Asterisk in the days that followed, the clip of the exchange became more than a viral moment. It became an example. Analysts on both sides of the political spectrum commented on how Jasmine had handled the situation with grace and clarity. That, one anchor said, is how leadership looks when provocation fails. For many watching, it was a reminder that control doesn't require force, and confidence doesn't need to be loud. Her calmness didn't just silence an insult. It elevated the standard of conduct in a space often ruled by ego. Linda McMahon's attempt to undermine her had, ironically, achieved the opposite effect. The moment that was meant to diminish Jasmine only expanded her credibility. It showed that no matter the setting, whether a committee hearing or a public debate, integrity has its own power. Crockett didn't need to respond emotionally because she trusted her preparation, her record, and her truth. That trust translated into authority. Every line she spoke carried the weight of facts and the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need validation to prove her worth. By the end, Jasmine Crockett's name wasn't trending because of controversy, it was trending because of control. The hearing became a case study in how to handle disrespect without losing focus, how to use composure as a counterpunch, and how to let professionalism speak louder than pride. She didn't win through aggression, she won through precision, and that kind of victory doesn't fade quickly. As the story settled into public memory, one thing became undeniable. Jasmine had not only flipped the hearing, she had rewritten its tone. What began as an insult, ended as inspiration. She reminded everyone watching that dignity, when paired with discipline, can silence even the